Hello, everyone, and welcome on into week 6. We're already close to the halfway mark of the college football season. It goes by fast, so enjoy it every week you can. And when you're with this group of three college football gamblers, except for a certain pick that happened last week, you usually end up a winner if you listen to this show. My name is Joe Tansey alongside Ryan Beef Coyle and Mark Henry Jr. Guys, the game of the year happened on Saturday. We're not talking about Mark Henry's bets. We're talking about just Georgia and Alabama in general. Let's start there because not only did this thing shake up the playoff race, it also shook up the Heisman race as well. And we every week kind of do a stock up, stock down on the playoff and the Heisman. I think we need to get right into it. Maybe not with the Heisman this week because I think there's only three guys whose stock really moved, and that's Jalen Milroe, Travis Hunter, and then Carson Beck on the other side. But in terms of the playoff now, this makes things a lot interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Alabama comes out, and I left the bar, and they were up, I think, 3 touchdowns, and I walked home, and I walked in my sister's apartment, and I was pretty shell-shocked at what was going on. But Alabama, I mean, I had them winning the game last week, but it still doesn't really change my total opinion of them. I mean, we saw kind of at their high what they can be and what they could look like. But then they took their foot off the gas a little bit, got a little bit cute, and let Georgia come back into it. They still have tough games to go in the SEC. I had this pegged as a win because of plain and simple home field advantage is why I kind of gave them the nod in the quarterback play. So my overall opinion of Alabama doesn't really change, neither does Georgia. My stance on Georgia coming into the year was I thought their 3 hardest games were all on the road, at Alabama, at Texas, and at Ole Miss. That's not changing. Even with Ole Miss loss last week, I still think that's going to be a tough game because that's pretty much the Ole Miss Super Bowl this year. So I don't think really I have a disparaging opinion on either one of these squads, but I think it was a little bit of like kind of self-vindication of what Alabama can be. And Jalen Milroe looked like the best player in the country.
Let's throw Ole Miss into the conversation too, because woof, that was a brutal loss to Kentucky. So we sat here last week talking about the SEC, and I threw, I think it was 6 teams out there. So we're now down to 5. Like let's be honest here, Ole Miss, when you're in that congested of a bubble in the SEC, you can't lose that game. Now, look, I get it if they somehow miraculously beat Georgia, which I don't think any of us see happening. Maybe they get back into the mix. But I think right now, Georgia, Bama, Texas, Tennessee, question mark Missouri are kind of where we stand with the SEC. But the top 4 is kind of like a firm lock 4. Go ahead, Mark.
I'm not like the Florida State guy. I will eat the crap, and I'll talk about in a second the Georgia Alabama. But you don't. So sorry. You think Ole Miss, if they lose to Georgia, you don't think 10-2 Ole Miss gets in?
Not with a loss to Kentucky at home.
Yeah.
And then look, it's all
Kentucky goes the rest of the way.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all situational too, right? Because I could sit here for hours and talk about playoff scenarios. But if your 4 in firm lockstep here are Texas, Georgia, Bama, Tennessee from the SEC, right? The Big 12 keeps knocking itself out, right? Utah losing, big deal. So look,
Big 12 and the Big 12 and the ACC are getting 2 bits. They're not getting an outlook. Maybe Clemson.
I think Clemson.
Maybe Clemson. If Clemson wins out and loses to Miami in the ACC championship, I think that's the only scenario I can see the ACC or the Big 12 getting a 3rd team in.
I would right now pencil in, let's say, Clemson as the 3rd team of that group, and then Miami and K-State.
Basically, whoever right in winner. You don't even have to say who it is right now. Iowa State, K-State, BYU.
And it's going to be. I think we said it was going to be a chaotic conference. I don't think we thought expected. I don't think we expected this type of chaos with the Big 12. But then the Big 10 hasn't sorted itself out yet. That's the thing, and it will. But you have Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, USC, and Michigan are still in the mix. So. Look, if we're sitting at 4-4, 4 SEC, 4 Big 10, then we have Miami. We have entered Big 12 winner here. That's 10. You have your G5 team, which I get it. It's got to be either Boise or UNLV at this point, and then that mystery spot, right? And I think that's kind of, does it all play itself out? Like we say it all will play itself out, right? Because with the 4 team, it usually got down to 6 and maybe 5, and sometimes even 4. But I think in this case with the 12, I think it's going to figure itself out. But I think when you look at Georgia and Bama, I don't think they're missing the playoff, either of them at this point.
We might have to factor in a certain team coached by a man named Coach Siggs into this conversation as well. They might be 11-1. I mean, it's the Big Ten's kind of shaping up nicely. If you look at who has to play each other, like you don't have to see like Oregon and Penn State don't play each other. I don't think Oregon has to play USC. Am I wrong on that?
They have to play or Ohio State.
I know they play Michigan.
I think they play Michigan, Ohio State. I don't think they play USC. I think it plays out that a couple of the Big Ten teams avoid each other, whereas it feels like in the SEC, everybody's touching each other. Like Tennessee plays Bama and Georgia. You look at Texas plays Georgia still coming up here. Like it just feels like the SEC has more opportunity to knock itself out a little bit more than feels like the Big Ten's kind of the big winners, I guess, of Notre Dame, the ACC, and the Big 12 throwing up all over themselves at different points this year.
I hate to mention them, but I know you despise this, but I told you a few weeks ago where we were gonna lie here. Notre Dame keeps winning, and if we're looking at 4 spots on each, SEC and Big Ten, the ACC has eliminated itself in week 1. The Big 12 essentially eliminated itself last week from at-large spots. You're telling me if the 12th team or 11th team, we're going to call it because the 12th team is the G5 team, you're telling me if the playoff committee sees one loss Notre Dame just sitting there at like 13 or 14 in the AP poll, that they don't say, hey, you're the 11 seed. Go play somewhere in the South and good luck.
I think it depends how Louisville, A&M, and USC all kind of end up this year, if assuming they would win a USC game. It would be fun if Notre Dame USC was like a potential playoff matchup in that last week of the year to get into the playoff. USC's got a pretty tough schedule before then, so we'll see if they can get to that point. But yeah, I did not think they were going to beat Louisville. I was legitimately shocked to see them beat Louisville. It felt like they were trying to give away the game at multiple points there, but they figured out a way to win. Real quick, I'll just rewind because I didn't talk about.
I'll tee you up. Don't worry.
Okay, all right.
I'll tee you up.
Notre Dame's plus 115 now, though, to make it. After the NIU game was plus
115.
Yeah.
Wow.
After the NIU game was plus 360. So I think it just goes to show you what we were talking about any week. I mean, no one had Kentucky winning last week. No one had NIU beating Notre Dame. I mean, there's going to be
college football. There's
going to be a game this week. Well, I mean, we'll probably talk about it at some point, but Washington is a 3-point favorite at home over number 10 Michigan. And number 10 Michigan's right there in the playoff picture, playoff talk again after we completely wrote them off after Texas. But how sustainable really is that offense going forward?
And another note, like we completely wrote off Clemson, right? We said straight up after week 1, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, I don't think I said this outwardly, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh no, we're doing this wrong because Clemson's done this before where they embarrass themselves in week 1 on national TV and then just not in this fashion. They've dog walked a bunch of teams, and I don't think we've seen them this version of Clemson in the last few years. But all of a sudden, like if that touchdown is actually a touchdown at the end of the Vatek Miami game on Friday night, Dabo's waking up Saturday morning being like, I'm the king of the ACC again. Like I had a tweet ready for it because I'm like, wait a second, we've not talked about Clemson, and I think not talking about Dabo is a good thing. I think the less Dabo we have in our lives, the better. And in November, I'll be okay with talking about him, but he's kind of gotten really insufferable.
I think we thought that their schedule was going to be harder. Like App State, we thought was going to be better. NC State, we thought was going to be better. Obviously, at Florida State, we thought was going to be a much tougher game.
I think we thought the entire. I mean, look, this is and we'll get to this week's games, but
yeah,
Clemson, Florida State at the beginning of the year, we circled this game. This was supposed to be the premier game of the week. Florida State just lost by 20 plus points on the road to SMU, and Clemson's a 14.5 point favorite now. Like it's insane to think like what our expectations were versus the reality of the situation. It really is just insane.
We thought a late season trip to Blacksburg for Virginia Tech was going to be a lot tougher for Clemson too. And
although I think Vatek, they got off the mat on Friday. Now whether that was just for Miami, TBD.
It's funny though, the line I think opened at -18 for Clemson this week, and since DJU sounds like he's out, but he has the injury now, it's now moved down 2 points in Clemson's Florida State's favor. That just goes to show you what the difference between DJU and freaking Brock Glenn is in the minds of Vegas, and how bad DJ's been.
It's just an unknown.
So let's get to it. I know we hinted at the start. Look, I sided with Georgia, but I wasn't as big of a Georgia guy as Mark. So let's talk about maybe not the game, because a lot has been made about the game already. But Georgia, where they stand right now, they're gonna beat Auburn's ass on Saturday. I would hammer the 23.5. I don't really care what you think about either team. I think they have Auburn and Mississippi State back to back. They're going to win those games by 30 plus. We're not going to learn a damn thing about them. So what does Georgia need to do to get ready for this second half of the season and be ready for this gauntlet that they're going to play? And what from Saturday, Mark, either impresses you or not? First half, obviously not. The second half, yes. What about the performance on Saturday either makes you really concerned or makes you believe in them to get back in the playoff and even the SEC title race at this point?
At this point, I don't know why anyone would want to hear my opinion on Georgia after last week. I think it was pretty concerning to see the way Jalen Milroe ran all over them. They actually stopped the running game from the running backs pretty well. But there are a lot of mobile quarterbacks in the top teams this year. I mean, looking around the SEC, like Jackson Dart can move, Nico can move, even Ewers can move to a certain degree. Obviously, none of them to Milroe's degree, but that's something that the other teams will probably be copying against Georgia, getting their quarterback with the ball in his hands. So that's something to point out. But I think it's more funny to talk about the story of the game. Funny enough, and Beef knows this because he asked me before because last week I was pumping two bets all week long, and it was the Cowboys on Thursday night and Georgia on Saturday. And I had Cowboys -4.5 when the line opened. So
you at least got that one in.
I got that in. And so that was going to be the initial game of the year. I was going to go double game of the year, but Dallas was my favorite one at -4.5. That line ended up moving to 6.5. And I kind of felt bad being like game of the year, even though I have -4.5 from Monday and it's 6.5. I bet it like it was a game of the year, but I didn't call it like that. And didn't have people disagreeing with me on it, so I wasn't as vocal about it. But that cashes. I go 6-2 on Saturday outside of the Georgia game. Sunday rolls around. I had the best Sunday of my life gambling on the NFL, and I'm sitting here like with my in the guillotine trying to answer for my 11-unit loser. But yeah, I was totally wrong. I really underestimated Ryan Williams above everything. I mean, the guy's an absolute.
So 17. Star. Remember that.
Yeah, it's the new Mbappe.
Are you serious?
It's the new Matt Stafford and Clayton Kershaw. Did you know they went to school together?
Yeah. And
Russell Wilson has never got an MVP
basketball. Yeah.
Did you know Matt? Did you know Matt Ryan went to school in Philadelphia?
Yeah.
That used to be overused too.
That's a good one there too. But yeah, Ryan Williams was incredible. The biggest takeaway from the weekend is, oh my God, Ryan Williams and Jeremiah Smith are going to be the greatest wide receivers of all time in 3 years when they get to the NFL. Like, it's unbelievable how good, obviously Ryan Williams in the big game, but Jeremiah Smith even looks like more of like an NFL body almost than Williams. Like Williams is probably more like electric, whereas Smith is like the Marvin Harrison Jr. type, where it's just like oh, that guy's like polished as an NFL wide receiver right now at age 18. It's crazy to see both of them as good as they are so young.
So does Georgia end up making the playoff?
I lean yes, but it's tough. They put themselves in a big hole here. I mean, their schedule is so hard that maybe you could get a 9-3 Georgia into the playoff if things fall right. I do know someone was talking about like the last couple years. If you looked at the top 12, there'd be some 9-3 teams getting in. If you look at that 11, maybe that 10 seed over the last couple years, I think Arizona was pretty close last year to that number at 9-3. It's going to depend how it plays out. Are there more kind of 2-loss and less teams with the way that the playoff kind of incentivizes teams to stay motivated late in the year? And that's going to be kind of the interesting part. And that's what we don't know right now. But I lean yes, but I certainly wouldn't bet it either way.
It's -230 for yes right now, +220 for no.
I'm surprised it's that low, but yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, look, you could take a shot in the no and say, look, I wasn't impressed with their start against Bama and and even their start against Kentucky. Like, I think you could build enough of a case where you could say no.
Absolutely. You could definitely build the case. I will say, I do think they'll beat Ole Miss. That Ole Miss game, the biggest problem with that game is that it really felt like they got dominated in the trenches. And that was kind of the big, everyone told us that Ole Miss got all these transfers in, and they're not only just this skill position, run and shoot, Lane Kiffin team, but now they actually have the SEC lines. Didn't look like it against Kentucky, and Kentucky's not Georgia. So that's where I think Georgia probably wins that one. And if you win that one, that's a pretty marquee win probably. So it's going to be interesting.
Beef, I'll tee you up for this one. So the Heisman odds have shifted greatly since we last spoke. Jalen Milroe, the favorite at DraftKings Sportsbook, at +250, understandably so. Cam Ward, second favorite at +500. Travis Hunter now third at +700. And Ashton Jonty, the running back from Boise State, is +1,000. The only three names below 2,000 that I didn't mention were Dylan Gabriel at +1,400, and we haven't seen much of him yet. Nico from Tennessee at +1,500. We'll see more of him as the season goes on. And Jackson Dart at +1,600 for Ole Miss. I think that ship kind of sailed. But when you look at the Heisman race right now and how it's shaping up, Beef, what's the approach? I know we're two of you are sitting here with Nico tickets, so I will preface it by that. But now that Milroe's the favorite and a pretty clear favorite, how would you approach if you were dipping into the Heisman market this week? How would you approach it?
I mean, this is just such an ebb and flow thing. Like, I don't like to take the Heisman during the season because I remember, I want to say it was week 5 or week 6 last year, J.J. McCarthy was the favorite to win the Heisman. Mm-hmm. Like, this can change so much. Jalen Milroe could go out there and have a terrible game in a couple of weeks against Tennessee, cost him the game, and Nico outduels him. Nico's then jumping him to be the Heisman there at, instead of 15-1 +250. There's no reason at all to put any money on Jalen Milroe at +250 right now because he's going to drop below that, no doubt about it, at some point this season. Someone else is going to most likely take over, whether, Cam Ward goes out there and has a great week against Cal, lights it up, 400 yards, 4 touchdowns. Milroe has a more reserved game against Vandy this week and kind of, a fallback type spot. They could flip this week. I mean, it's such just an up and down thing.
I disagree with that. I think he's got probably a 2-week cushion for the favorite. Because I'll preface this by saying this: Miami's playing a Cal this weekend at 10:30. Milroe's going to have Milroe that nobody's going to be watching. I see what you're saying. Still Miami at Cal. I think Milroe and Ward will flip at some point if Miami keeps winning, but I think Milroe's got him. At least for this week, I think he's got a cushion because he's got the best win on the board.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the Heisman moment. It's also the moment that's living in everyone's head now.
Right.
If this game, I think I said this last week on the show, if that game was week 11, week 12 or whatever, instead of week 4, that's like your defining Heisman winning game. I'm not saying that this performance is going to go forgotten, but as the season goes on and that was really the first big week of conference play last week. You're going to have not much bigger games, but huge games down the line with some of these top guys having the opportunity to have their own Heisman moment. I mean, last year was such a crazy race between Nix, Daniels. Daniels I think with 3 weeks to go was over 10-1 to win it. It was looking like Nix and Penix type race. Travis Hunter continues to get built up. Great performance last week. And John T, is what he's doing sustainable right now? 985 yards and 12 touchdowns. I don't think it's that sustainable at this pace. And also, Mark has said it a couple of times. Are you really going to give the award to the running back out of Boise, Idaho, or the quarterback at Alabama or Miami?
If Ashton Jonty played at an SEC or Big Ten school and put up these
But
numbers,
he's also not putting these numbers up.
Sure,
I don't think so.
Well,
he did against Oregon,
these
but
numbers, but
I mean, if you plugged him into Ole Miss's offense, for just taking an example of a really soft non-con, if you plugged him into Ole Miss's offense, the numbers are probably similar because Judkins had a huge year last year, and it's not like they just completely abandoned the run. They have no problem running the ball. I think it's situational. I'm not saying it at like every SEC or Big Ten school, but if those numbers have an SEC or Big Ten program attached to it, he's the prohibitive favorite, and I don't think it's very close at this point.
So this is not from a gambling standpoint or a who's going to win standpoint. There should be no conversation to me about who deserves to win right now, and it's Ashton Jonty. He's on pace for 2,747 rushing yards with 42 touchdowns. Like, is it sustainable? Probably not. But while he's doing this, I think it should not even be a conversation. You look, and maybe it's because I'm such a stat nerd, but you look at the rushing charts right now for the NCAA. He's almost 200 yards in front of anybody else. He's only played 4 games. There's a ton of guys who have played 5.
And he only played half of the Portland State game too.
Right.
It's insane. And this week he had 267 or no, I'm sorry. That's the first game. 259 rushing yards, 266 total yards. Nobody talked about it because he played Washington State. He plays on the blue field. It was at 10:30. I went to bed at halftime of the Georgia-Alabama game and missed the whole show, let alone the blue field 10:30 game. By the way, cash that Boise bet. But Ashton Jonty, it's unbelievable what he's doing right now. And I would normally, I think, have the opinion yeah, but it's at Boise. He ran for 192 yards and 3 touchdowns against Oregon and lost by a field goal on the road. It's not like it's only been Georgia Southern and Portland State. And Washington State, they're a legitimate team. They're not, they're a solid program still. So he's had 2 legitimate teams that he's put up numbers like this against. And there's not enough people talking about it.
I think if you were to give me a power ranking, say if you're like a weekly Heisman power ranking, I would put Jalen Milroe, Ashton Jonty, and Travis Hunter in the top 3.
I don't think most would put Jonty, and that goes to get
right.
Everything I just said. I don't think he will even get an invite to New York. Honestly,
he might, depending on what the numbers end up being. So it's a long season, and the fact that he's 4th on the odds board at least says something that the odds makers are paying attention to it. But I think if you were to, and this is strictly based off of performances through September. Yes, Cam Ward has put up a lot of numbers, but in terms of things that impressed me, Jalen Milroe has the best win on the board against Georgia and played really well in that game. Travis Hunter is the best player in college football, hands down. Hands down, is the most talented player in college football, and he's making an impact every week at Colorado. Now, whether Colorado's success is sustainable, we don't know, because no one expected them to beat UCF the way they did, but no one's expected anything that's happened in the Big 12 so far. And then you have Ashton Jonty, who's putting up video game numbers. Now, this will change, hands down. It's October 1st. Things will change across the board in the Heisman race. But right now, if you were to ask me my top 3, it's probably Milroe 1, and then a really tight race for 2 between Jonty and Hunter, and Cam Ward's probably my number 4, only because I have these 3 specific things that stick out in my head with the first 3.
The Milrow thing's tough for me. I sound like a hater, obviously, but he's the 57th in passing. Like I understand he only played 4, some played 5, and he adds a lot on the ground as well. But it's just tough for me, like stat wise. I will just say Jackson Dart's not out of it. I do think, as I just said, like I think Georgia's going to beat them, so probably that might take him out of it. But his stats, even in that game, he put up like 260 and a touchdown, didn't throw a pick. Like he didn't tank his stats. His stats at the end of the year, he's got 1,800 yards through 5 games. Like we're gonna look up and he's gonna have like 4,500 yards.
Oh, sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no
He's gotta
doubt.
beat somebody.
I think he has. If you're gonna look at like the quarterbacks from last year, not like with Jaden Daniels having multiple losses, Jackson Dart is the player I could see fitting into that the most, rather than a winning quarterback in this scenario. Bo Nix is like Jalen Milrow, Cam Ward is like Michael Penix from last year, like similar, where those two teams might be undefeated, 1-loss teams, but Jackson Dart winds up putting up better numbers, only has 2 losses. I think that's kind of your discussion towards the end, and who knows, maybe Quinn Ewers gets back in the discussion as well, but that's, I think, a conversation for next week, starting with, the best week of the season.
I don't think I said this last week, but I don't think there's any chance he gets back in.
I'd like to plant this flag in case this team continues to win. Cade Klubnik has some intrigue to him.
Please no, I'll be all over.
As crazy as that sounds, if Clemson's there, his odds will drop. And look, Drew Aller's got a chance. We haven't talked about Penn State whatsoever, but they've got a big game against USC in 2 weeks. That might put him on the spotlight too. Like, we never know how these big games are going to play out. But if you're kind of projecting for teams that really haven't been in the spotlight yet, Clemson hasn't been in the spotlight since week 1 and probably won't be for another few weeks because this Florida State games means absolutely nothing. And then Penn State next week. I mean, look, they're going to play UCLA this week, and I'll transition here into the bets because look, it's James Franklin hammer time here. But if Aller plays well against UCLA and then plays well on the national stage against USC, he'll trickle himself into the conversation. Not saying he's going to win it, but there are a few guys sitting at plus 2,500 or higher that will make themselves known by the end of October. That's all I'll say with that. Let's move on to week 6. Look, the card isn't intriguing, but that's where we make the most of our money. Look, I already hinted at the one game I'm really honed in on with Penn State, only a 4-touchdown favorite against UCLA. Look, there aren't many big games on the schedule. Game day is going to Cal for Miami Cal, which cool. They're just doing something different because there's no marquee games. But there is a ranked game, Missouri and Texas A&M, and I guess we'll start there. A&M's a 2-point favorite at home. Mizzou hasn't impressed whatsoever this season. Struggled against Vanderbilt last time out. How does this game end up playing out, guys?
I don't have like a feel on the winner yet. It definitely reminds me a lot of the spot with Notre Dame going to there. And we know how that wound up going. I would probably, I have it on my card right now. Haven't bet it yet, but under 48.5. I think every game that Texas A&M plays in against a quality opponent is going to be. I thought last week had the potential to be a track meet against Arkansas, and it was 14-7, I think 5 minutes in, and the game
things slowed down so fast.
The game went under. I think especially at home, if Texas A&M is able to kind of control the clock in all scenarios, they're going to want to play the under. Reminds me kind of Mizzou BC from a few weeks ago that wound up going under. I could see this being, pretty close to the total, like a 24-20 type game. But I don't have a feel for the winner right now. I don't want to trust Texas A&M with my money, and Mizzou hasn't looked good enough for me yet. But this is a huge spot for this Missouri team, who I think has a better chance at the end of the day to make the playoff than Texas A&M. You got to win this one because you still have Alabama, and I think if you're a 2-loss Missouri, I don't think you're going to be getting in with the rest of that schedule that they have.
Mark, we talked about a game a little bit earlier, just off of reference because the line is so confounding. Number 10, Michigan, is on the road at Washington and is a 2.5-point dog. The over-under is 41.5. Make this make sense to me.
I do want to get back to that Missouri game, but I think it's they watched the Minnesota game and they watched USC. If USC would have just committed to stopping the run and not worried about the pass at all and loaded the box a little bit more, I think that game probably goes differently. And there's obviously a pick six that swung that game that they only ended up winning by 3 as well. So I think that's what they're looking at. Like 2 straight weeks winning by 3. I think they probably think it's not sustainable traveling across the country. I wouldn't bet it either way, but I think if I was, I would bet Washington. I thought there was a chance Washington would be better than kind of how we were pegging them coming into the year. Like I guess that they did go on the road or they took care of business against Northwestern. They didn't look terrible at Rutgers. They lost by a field goal. Even their bad loss against Washington State, if Jed Fish doesn't make a terrible play call at the end of the game, they might win the game. So it's hard to know what to make of Washington right now. That's why it's kind of hard to even have a take on the game. But Vegas is telling you something. I would have said that last week with UCF being like a 15-point favorite against Colorado, and then they lost by 1 billion. So who knows? But with Missouri, that's one of my favorite. The closer we get, the more I like Missouri. It just feels like, yeah, they haven't looked great, but they've probably been gearing up for this exact game with kind of little worry about losing the first 4. The last 2 got a little dicier. They did get 2 weeks off, whereas A&M kind of had to fight for their life last week against Arkansas in a game that went down to the wire. Missouri's had the chance to prepare for A&M for 2 weeks. I do think Drinkwitz is a good offensive coach. I think he'll have a pretty good game plan here. I just think that you look at Texas A&M, they've lost 6 straight ranked matchups dating back to last year. They're 3-11 as a ranked team at home playing a higher ranked team. They just don't really come through in these spots, it feels like, unless it's Alabama. It feels like the only times A&M does come through in these spots, it's against Bama. But I like Missouri a lot in this game, and the closer we get, it's kind of creeping up my favorite list on the weekend.
Beef, talk to me a little bit about Michigan, because if you look at their schedule, man, it's a gauntlet. Now that we know how the Big Ten's playing out, they're at Washington this week, so it actually kind of turns into a quasi must win for them, because their final 6 games, 4 of them are against teams currently in the top 25. They have to go to Illinois, they have to go to Indiana, which is proving to be a pretty difficult game. They have Ohio State at the end of the season, and they host Oregon at the start of November. That's shaping up to be 4 pretty tough games. Then you have the rivalry game with Michigan State mixed in. Northwestern's really the only easy game after this. So what do you make of Michigan right now? And I hate calling games must win in October, but it kind of feels like one, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's funny when you look at it and see Michigan number 10 next to their name, and then you go and look on DraftKings. They are plus 800 to make the playoff and minus 1,600 to miss it. That just kind of goes to show you what Vegas thinks of them going forward. And I think that's obviously indicated in the line this week. I heard a good point today, and they were saying, like, when you look at the Washington coaching staff, that's a staff full of NFL guys. You don't think they're going to be able to easily decipher this one-dimensional Michigan run offense. I mean, they're probably going to have a good game plan cooked up. And I know going into last week before the Rutgers game, I'm not sure if it continued after, but Washington was the best tackling team in the country. Like, percentage of missed tackles was the lowest out of anyone. You're going to have to make key, sound, fundamental tackles against this Michigan team because they're just going to come at you and run the ball and run the ball and run the ball. Washington seems like a good team suited to do that. Washington State, though, ran over them a little bit, especially with the quarterback. The white guy Hater, I think is his last name, or Mateer out at Wazoo. Yeah, name escaping me, but that might be someone that Michigan looks to do a lot with Orgy this week and run the football with him. But I really think the under's got to be a play in that one. I think it's going to be a slugfest, a lot like it was last week for Washington against Rutgers. But yeah, Michigan gauntlet of a schedule coming up, and I think that minus 1,600 to miss the playoff right now goes to show you just everything you need to know about the rest of their season.
So we're at the point of the season where we have enough, at least of a sample size on certain teams, where we know who's bad and we know who's really kind of put themselves out of the playoff picture. Florida State, we're talking about Oklahoma State, a bunch of these teams that have disappointed. But there's a bunch of teams also, especially in the Big Ten, I think has the highest concentration of these teams that are surprising teams, have come out of nowhere, and now are at least in the conversation nationally. I'm not saying playoff wise, but now in a week like this where there aren't many marquee games, there's a few more eyeballs on them. And starting with our favorite team to bet on, Coach Sig and the Indiana Hoosiers. I just kind of want to run through a few of these games with teams that we haven't talked too much about or are starting on the rise here. And look, Indiana is front and center and leading that group. They're a 13.5-point favorite against Northwestern this week. Is this the end of it? This feels like the prototypical Big Ten spot. Like it makes absolutely no sense that Northwestern wins or even is close in this game. Am I overthinking this? Is basically what I'm asking.
I think you are. I'm going to continue to bet Indiana against the spread until they give me a reason. Otherwise, they're just looking like a good football team, plain and simple. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. I'm just going to continue riding Indiana, keep it plain and simple with that.
Mark, have you frozen? Oh, we're mute. Oh, he's muted. Hold on.
That was my bad. That's rookie stuff from me. I agree with everything Beef said, so I don't have much to add. I'm smoking on that Coach Siggs pack. We have to all get that shirt. We have to get the shirt Joe Buckner's wearing.
It is. Shirt, yeah. It is pretty impressive. A team I mentioned last week in the Big 12, Iowa State. Now, look, they certainly weren't impressive against Houston. I think it was 20-0 or 21-0. They just kind of grinded that result out, but they're facing a team in Baylor where they are, let me get it up, a 12-point favorite. Is this a team where we just keep running with them as well? I know we don't have some Matt Campbell enthusiasts here in the building, but it seems like they just keep winning. You guys have any thoughts on them? I'm taking them the 12 against Baylor.
Yeah, not on my card this week. I don't have anything in that one, but Iowa State, I put out my, playoff projections as of today, and I have Iowa State as my Big 12 representative. I think they have a pretty easy schedule, but we've said that about a lot of other teams, and there could be a fall flat spot, obviously, in there at some point, but I have them going 11-0 until they meet up with Kansas State in Week 12. I think that, or their 12th game of the season. So, that could be a interesting team if we see Iowa State in the first 12-team college football playoff. I don't think many people would have pegged that 1 to 2 years ago when it looked like Matt Campbell kind of situation was going downhill there.
I don't even think they're good. They might go 11-0 or 11-1 or 12-0. I don't even think they're good. They beat North Dakota 21-3. They beat Iowa by 1. I know that's a rivalry game. I get it, but even Houston, I get they won 20-0. Houston's been bad.
Houston's been real bad.
I'm not impressed by Iowa State. They might win Big 12. The Big 12 is terrible. I don't know. I was trying to throw support behind UCF before last week and look at them. I hesitate to say anything definitive about the Big 12.
So, on that note, let's talk about some of the bets we have for this week, guys, because it is one of those weeks where some of the favorites or some of the teams that we expect to see on the big stage aren't. It's one of those blah kind of weeks when you have the schedule. Is there anything, I guess, in the crumbs, if we want to call it that, Navy Air Force over under 35, the Service Academy unders in play, something along those lines for week 6 that either of you may have your eyes on?
I won't go to my favorite bet yet. I'll go to the money in the crumbs one, but Hawaii, San Diego State under 50.5. I was looking at that. If you look so far at San Diego State's games, they have had really, really low scoring games. 1-3 or 3-1 to the under. Hawaii is 4-0 to the under so far this year. And you look at San Diego State, 22-21 last week against Central Michigan, going pretty far under. 31-10. They put up 0 against Oregon State. It's just, I think that these offenses are pretty terrible. You look at the leading rusher for Hawaii, he's got 112 yards. They've played 4 games. He's averaging 30 yards a game. He's their leading rusher. San Diego State, Their leading passer has 567 yards. Like they're throwing for like 120 passing yards a game. Like it's just these are not good offenses. So money in the crumbs spot there at 8:00 on good old CBSSN. But I like the under there in Hawaii, San Diego State. RIP to the Mountain West.
I will drop one for you because I faded this team last week, and who, buddy, are they potentially very bad? And that's UAB. Tulane is a wagon, and John Sumrall coming from Troy has come in and worked wonders there. I think we all sat here last Tuesday thinking that USF had a little bit of a chance in New Orleans last week. They had no chance whatsoever. That game was over by probably the first quarter. And you can say the exact same thing about UAB against Navy. Navy just ran them off the field, literally. Blake Horvath, by the way, if we're talking about like Heisman, like if the season ended today, I'd put him in the top 10. I'm not saying put him in the top 4, but he'd at least somebody out there would put him in there. Tulane just ran through USF 45-10. UAB is a much worse team, and UAB's defense has not been good in 3 games against FBS opponents. They lost 32-6 to Louisiana Monroe. They gave up 37 to Arkansas and then 41 to Navy. They've been beaten every which way up and down the field. I think Tulane minus 15 is a steal.
And did you see Trent Dilfer, UAB's coach, at the press
loser.
conference? His kid was crying, and he's like, bring him up here. It's not like this is Alabama or anything. It's like, oh, my God. What a weirdo. What a loser Trent Dilfer.
That was such a horrible hire in the first place.
The best quote in television history is, you can't win games in the NFL by losing them. That's a famous Trent Dilfer line there. And I think it's prophetic.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. Can I ask you guys a question? Why is Georgia Tech a 9-point favorite against air right now, against anyone? Why do we think Georgia Tech is good? Do we think they're good because they won by 3 against Florida State a month and a half ago now? Do we think they're good because they beat VMI or Georgia State? Like the 2 times they've played real opponents in the last 4 weeks, they lost by 12 to Louisville. They didn't cover, and they lost at Syracuse as a favorite, and they didn't cover. So obviously, because they lost outright. I don't get why Georgia Tech is a 9-point favorite against Duke. I'm not telling you Duke's great. I get it might be a little bit of a sucker spot. I think a lot of suckers will see the 5-0 sitting next to Duke's name, and it's not like they've played a great schedule. They do have a really good running back in Star Thomas, who's really fun name, Star Thomas. And Malik Murphy's been pretty good this year. He's been pretty solid.
He's been better than Haynes King.
Keep
going. You're talking me into Duke 8.5. Keep doing it.
Yeah. I mean, Malik Murphy, 1,226 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 4 picks. I think Duke's the better team here, to be honest. And they're a 9-point dog. Like, I think they're live. I mean, hey, I gave out USF last week, and I thought they were a live dog. You'll get plenty of these wrong, but I think Duke could win this game. I really do. I don't get why it's a 9-point. If this was 3, 4, I'm probably not looking at it. I'm probably not thinking about it or watching it. But a 9-point spread, and what's the money line here? Plus 260. I'm seeing. I mean that's crazy. I think that's my favorite bet of the week.
You've talked me into it. I just want to let you know.
There we go. So you can hold me accountable next week for losing. I'm all in on Duke.
So I'm true story. I despise Duke basketball. Have since I was like a kid, and like my wife always. We've talked about like getting a dog, and she's like, "Oh, I think Duke would make it like a great name for it." And I said, "Absolutely not. That's never happening ever in my life. If I got a dog named Duke, I would be ridiculed throughout my entire family for the rest of my life."
What about your daughter? Will you name her Duke?
No, that's not an acceptable female name.
What about K? K-A-Y?
No, that's also out of the picture.
Well, can I have my money in the crumbs game?
Go ahead.
I'll give you a 3-pack out. System
Give
play,
it to me.
Navy Air Force under 35. I locked that in before it moves down to like 31 or something by kickoff.
It will be bet down.
Yeah, I took Army minus 11.5 versus Tulsa this week. Army's looked pretty awesome with a nice blend of the triple option, the passing now. They're doing a little bit of everything. I'm praying for an undefeated Army-Navy game this year. That would be an awesome kind of storyline at the end of the
Would
season.
that be for the playoff?
It could be.
It'd be the best thing ever. It would be so awesome.
Is Army still independent? Or are they in the American?
It's a good question.
I have that up. Hold on.
Because is that like
they're both in the American.
Yeah, could they potentially meet in the title game and then Army-Navy as well?
Oh my God. I have no idea how that would work.
They're the only two undefeated teams in the American, and they're both 3-0 in conference play.
Could there be a back-to-back weeks?
I mean,
I don't know.
I mean,
That's never,
now,
obviously
like,
never,
you with like
it's obviously never happened.
Games.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
crazy.
can we speak that into? I mean,
like Kansas State, Iowa State could be a Big 12 title game, and they play in the last week of the season.
Right, but they wouldn't play after though. Hold on. So you have. I'm trying to go through who the contenders are in the American. So Memphis, I guess USF would still be considered. Tulane. You know what? Is that our official like root for chaos? I mean, so Army doesn't play any of those three teams I just mentioned.
And Army-Navy is the week after conference championships, right?
Navy. So Navy they both have to play Notre Dame, but that doesn't matter because it's not a conference game. Army's schedule looks incredibly light. Army's at what? Army's at after this week against Tulsa. Army is either at home or at a neutral site for 6 of their final 7 games.
Don't count out either of those teams beating Notre Dame. But
their only road game is North Texas, who, by the way, North Texas is actually really good. So that actually might throw a wrench in our plans.
I would say 12-1, even if they won a conference title game. 12-1 Army or 12-1 Navy probably doesn't get in over 11-1 Boise or 12-1 Boise or UNLV if they stayed like undefeated. But yeah.
Final money in the crumbs play James Madison minus 16.5 against UL Monroe. Take that one to the counter as well.
No, now I'm thinking about this Army Navy. Could they play in the American Championship? And then look, it's possible. There's a lot of ball left.
I'll throw another one out there, and this is kind of me and Beef were talking about it today. I gave out Virginia under 4.5 wins as one of my favorite plays.
Yeah, and how are we doing on that?
Obviously not great, 3-1. But to be fair, and I caught me and Beef were breaking it down today. 2 of those wins I gave them when we were talking about it, Richmond and Coastal. I assumed that they were getting those wins. I obviously thought Virginia was going to be much worse than they are. They're a much better team than I thought they'd be. They're doing a good job. That 1-point win at Wake Forest where they came from behind, they were down 2 touchdowns. That's probably the one that's going to screw me. I think they probably get to 5, and that probably is the one that breaks the back. They're going to lose to Louisville, Clemson, Notre Dame, and I still think they lose at Virginia Tech. So at this point, I need them to not win 2 of Boston College, North Carolina at home, at Pitt, and SMU at home. I need them to go 1-3 in those 4 games. And none of them are like gimmies. They have a weird schedule of like, they don't have a single game left on the schedule that you're like, that's definitely a win. But those 4 are probably not games you look at and say definitely a loss. I mean, look, this one's a 1-point spread this week, and Castellanos is back at practice. I think Boston College is the much better team, even independent of whatever my preseason thought was about Virginia. I just gave you what their 3 wins are. They're Coastal. They're I just forgot the second one, and then they beat Wake Forest.
Richmond,
yeah. Boston College stuck with Missouri. Like this is a team that absolutely has impressed me. Bill O'Brien seems like he's just coaching on a much higher level than a lot of the guys he's going up against. Obviously, NFL head coach, OC at Bama. Like he's just coached in pretty important situations, and he's going up against these ACC guys. It seems like he's outmatching them. It seems like he's just a much better, schemer than these guys. Kind of similar to what Beef was talking about with the Washington guys on their staff coming from the NFL. I do think you see a little bit of a difference there. And even last week without Castellanos, they're able to figure it out against the Western Kentucky team that I know you guys thought were live, and obviously the Hilltoppers covered the spread.
They were
pretty
very
impressive.
live.
Needed a late comeback.
They
That was
were
one of
very,
those-
very.
That was one of those ones I looked. I was like, oh wow, they actually came back and won that game.
We were
But
up
even
20-7, Mark.
Yeah.
But without
We were
their
there.
starting quarterback, I think to win that game does say something.
Sure, absolutely.
Whoever started last week, I saw when he started at FIU against
Right,
Western
it was
Kentucky.
like 70
they lost
nothing to Western
8-0
Kentucky.
or something.
Yeah. Since we're an ACC positive podcast this week, NC State -5 against Wake Forest at home is super disrespectful. Wake Forest is, yeah, I know. Wake Forest is bad, like bad. NC State, if they had any sense of dignity, would do that. Would win that probably by 2 touchdowns. I'll close on this because the bounce back spot is one of our favorite spots in all of college sports, football or basketball. There are 3 bounce back spots. What didn't even have them in the conversation, so we'll make it 4, and we'll make this rapid fire. So we have Louisville against SMU at home. They are what are they? 7.5 favorite. Excuse me. Then you have Oklahoma State at home against West Virginia, 3.5 favorite. You have Georgia, who is 24 favorite against Auburn, and Ole Miss, only one on the road out of that 4, -9.5 at South Carolina. Just give me some quick thoughts on all 4 of those, or one of the group. Are there any slip ups, or do we see bounce backs for a majority of those teams?
I'm on Louisville. That's the one out of that group, the one I obviously brought it up for a reason. But I think Louisville bounces back. Brom's a really good coach. I think he gets the They impressed me last week watching that game against Notre Dame. Even though they lost the game, they didn't cover on the hook, obviously, on the 7. They're still they're a really well coached team. I think Brom is one of the better coaches in the sport, to be honest. Shuck is pretty good, really limits his mistakes. I think he only has 1 pick on the year so far. So obviously he's like 35 years old, so he better limit his mistakes at this point. It's like his 15th year in college football. But I like Louisville to take care of business. SMU's played an extra game, a little more tired, coming off of their biggest win of the year last week, even though, Florida State stinks, but it's still a name brand, I think, to a team like SMU. I think Louisville bounces back and beats them big time.
I locked in South Carolina +9.5 today. It looks like Sellers is going to come back in this one, and when he's played, they've beaten Kentucky, who might be a pretty good team actually after all, and they were beating LSU until he went out. I think it was 21-7 at one point. Then he started coming in and out, and Ashford was going in, but it sounds like Sellers is going to play this week. Ole Miss coming off a deflating loss. How do they bounce back? And that's a team too with Ole Miss. For all we talked about with the transfer portal and all the additions, that's not really necessarily like a huge team. Like they're not a group that's been together for a while, so you don't really know how they bounce back in situations like this. Their first kind of taste of adversity could be a live dog spot there because South Carolina, I think, has been a real surprising team and one of the more underrated home atmospheres in college football. Could be a live dog spot there, but I think that they're good enough to at least keep it in the game because they're good up front. And what did we see Ole Miss struggle with last week? Kentucky up front. So
I'm glad both of you mentioned those 2 games because I'm betting Georgia and I'm also betting Oklahoma State. I can't quit Mike Gundy, and this feels like the all-time spot where he just wins this game by 25 and no one bats an eye at it because they lost the big game last week.
I've got another bounce back spot for you guys. Can you guys believe Central Florida is favored by 2.5 in the swamp? Like that shit, when that line came out, they should have just been like, I'm sorry, we have to fire Billy Napier now. Like, it cannot be a 2.5 point home dog to UCF coming off of a 27-point loss as a 13-point favorite. Like it's pretty crazy. UCF's favored like that. I'm gonna trust Vegas and take it. I'm taking the 2.5. I'm taking UCF. I think Florida might be that bad. I think they really are just totally quit. This kind of goes against everything. I think they have the week off the week before this in Florida. I don't care. I'm taking UCF. I think Malzahn is going to coach circles around Billy Boy.
A lot of bounce back spots in week 6. Hopefully, a lot of money made as well, and hopefully, we'll see a lot more big games down the road in October. Not as important or more important as Miami and Cal, which gets the game day treatment this week. For everyone who has tuned in and listened, thank you so much. We'll be back here next Tuesday with a Week 7 preview. October gets really good over the
Holy
next
Grail
few
next
weeks.
week.
A lot of big games next week. We'll dive into all of those. For Ryan Coyle and Mark Henry Jr., I'm Joe Tansey. Best of luck on all of your bets. We'll see you again next week.